Well, thank you very much, Emma. Can you all hear? Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to come here. And thank you for plugging some of my books. That's very nice. I've put up Cennino Cennini for the nerdy amongst you, but you don't have to read that if you don't want to, because most of what I'm going to cover this evening is actually plundered from chapter 2 of the Alchemy of Paint, which is one of the books that Emma mentioned. But I'm very happy to go beyond that, obviously. But the reason why I chose this is because I think as a subject it helps situate the relationship between art and science, which is true up until the mid-late 17th century in Europe. It's only from the 18th century onwards that art and science became separated in Europe. And from the 19th century that science and religion became separated. And the state we're in today is a result, I believe, of those two separations globally because of Europe's influence. So I think I'm very interested in the postmodern world, and my particular angle on the postmodern world is, well, let's look at the pre-modern world. And so I want to use this as an example, a pre-modern example of how you can engage with the world without division into science, art, or religion as separate entities. And I want to use this example, Lapis Lazuli, because, and its conversion into the pigment ultramarine, because it is an almost textbook example of one of the fundamental ideas that underpinned European culture from, let's say, 400 BC to 1800 AD. And that's the four elements, which unfortunately we don't know now, although it's a very, very appropriate phenomenological way of looking at the world. So that's what lapis looks like. That's a bit of lapis. And it turns into ultramarine. And what I want to do is try and be looking at the Cennini's recipe within the context that he would have seen. So be, if you like, immersive as immersive as you can get with a PowerPoint, obviously, which is not very. But rather than try and situate things in the modern mentality, situate things in terms of the 13th, 14th century. So here we have a 14th century English map. And there we are in London. That's Dover down there, and you see a continuation of towns going up there, a couple of walls, and then you get to Scotland. And I hope you can see that Scotia is also called Ultramarina. Ultramarine means overseas, and so what Matthew Paris, who made this map in St Albans, which is just north of Cambridge, north of London, he's kind of implying that if you want to go to Scotland, don't go over the roads, go round overseas. And if you think that map doesn't look much like Great Britain, that's because we've become too indoctrinated by Google Earth. And if you manage to find your way around London using the tube map, you know that actually connectivity in the tube map bears no relation to geography whatsoever. So we ought to recognize that this is prioritizing what's called the Great North Road and bending the coastline to match. It's not that he didn't know what Britain looked like, even without Google Earth. If we want to look at another map, this time this is much more recognizable in coastline, and you can see Brittany, Bay of Biscay, Portugal, Spain, going into the Mediterranean. And this looks, it's a similar date, and it looks recognizable because it's a portolan, and a portolan is not a road map, it's a sea map. So obviously you need to know the coast, and you distort the roads to accommodate the coast. Now, that's where we are. If you want to see where lapis comes from, because the name of the pigment is implying that lapis comes from overseas. It doesn't come from Scotland, but it does come from overseas. Then the interesting and a bit of a map is always on a physical map, if people still use those things, is always over the other fold of the piece of paper. So Rome, the first interesting place, is not on the map, and we actually have to go several more folds to the east to Kabul, which is the first city that lapis will come to on its route to Cennini for him to purify it. Oops, sorry. There's a blow up. And I think it's important to be using a contemporary map, because a contemporary map is going to give you an idea of what is not in the recipe. So some of what I'm talking about is what Cennini has written, but what interests me much more is what he didn't write. Because what he didn't write is the tacit knowledge that you will know as craftspeople cannot be written, but you have to learn it with your hands. And the cultural knowledge that he assumes you already know, so why bother writing it down? And the cultural knowledge for us, if you see Kabul is written there, you know, if we used current imagery of Kabul, you'd have a very, very different idea of what Afghanistan was. By using a medieval map of that shows Afghanistan, we see these three people, one of whom is pointing. Now, three men on a horse with crowns pointing. If you followed that finger, you'd find it was the Star of Bethlehem that he's pointing at. Tells you that these are the three wise men. So this map is implying that if Afghanistan is not the land of wisdom from which these three wise men came, it is certainly wiser than the Europe to which the material is coming. And if we look at what's going on in Afghanistan today outside of the news, then this photo is, I think, probably about 6 years, taken 6 years ago. There's a man with a rock on his back, carrying lapis from a mine. There's a mine on the other side of the valley. You can see the scree coming out of that mine is blue. He's probably got a Suzuki pickup truck at the valley floor, but from the valley floor up, what he's doing is the same as what has been done for 4,000 years. These mines have been worked non-stop for 4,000 years. They provided the lapis that was carved into scarabs by the Egyptians. They provided stuff for Mesopotamia. They provided stuff for Islam, the sphere of Islam, and they provided stuff for the sphere of Christendom. And from the valley floor up, the story is the same for 4,000 years. And the story is that this is completely snowbound for 9 months of the year. You have to, when the snows allow you to rebuild a path, you carry up firewood, you go into a cave, you set fire to it, and then you quench it with snow. And that thermal shock breaks the rock, and you carry that rock down on your back. So the activity is an activity that's still going on today. There is a saying which is the higher the rock, the closer to God, the better the blue, and that you can find lapis as long as God wants you to. So here's somebody who's found lapis. Now, you might think that by showing you a map with the three wise men, I am over-interpreting a bit of decoration on a map. So I just want to show you one other map to commit the same error. And this is the Hereford Map Mundi, around 1400 again. No, sorry, 1300. For those of you who don't know Mappamundis, a Mappamundi is, well, this particular one comes from Hereford Cathedral. It is about 50% smaller than life size. So this is a single piece of parchment, came from a very big cow. And it's the center of an altarpiece. So there's a wing on this side, which has got the Virgin Mary, and a wing on that side, which has got John the Evangelist. The frame still exists for this, but the two wing images have been lost, but this remains. And it's therefore an altar to be worshipped. This is a theophatic idea of the world as Christ. And actually you've got a head up here, you've got some hands there, and his feet are down here. So this is how to read the world as a theophany, a God-given gift. It could be used, if you wanted, as a literal map. Again, we can find London down here. For those who don't know Mappamundis, we're used to putting north at the top, but this puts east at the top. So that's the east, this is north, that's south, that's west. We are in the northwest. This is Britain, this rather fetal looking thing here, and that's Ireland. That's Norway, that's Sweden, that's the Baltic. So this all makes sense. You can find other, so Rome is on this map. So you could cross the English Channel, go up the Seine, walk a bit, go down the Rhone into the Mediterranean, or you could sail out. That's the Bay of Biscay. Then you'd go through the Pillars of Hercules and into the Mediterranean. Like the London Underground, this is distorted, and it's distorted in order to make the spiritual centre of Christendom into the physical centre of the world. And we only need one other landmark to find where Afghanistan is, because this is paradise. This paradise is in the east, it always has been. And we see in here Adam and Eve being expelled into India. So that is India. And we know that Afghanistan is to the north and the west of India. So that's where Afghanistan is. So I had one map which shows the three wise men coming as if from Afghanistan. This is saying that Afghanistan is the doorstep of paradise. And this is known by anybody who uses the pigment, because, which is why it's not worth Cennini saying anything. And the way in which this map has been distorted is not just to put Jerusalem in the center. It's also to have the three known continents arranged in the manner of this Tau cross. So that Asia is at the top, Europe is here, Africa is there. These are the three old continents of the old world. It's called a TO map or a Noachid map because it's the shape of a T and an O. It's called Noachid because after the flood, the three land masses here were each populated by one of Noah's sons and their wives. And they're separated by three bodies of water. The Mediterranean, again, you don't need, this is not obscure esoteric knowledge. Medi means middle, terra means earth. So this is the sea at the middle of the earth. And this, that separates Europe and Africa. And if you, what separates Europe and Asia is either the Don, River Don, or the River Danube, depending on who you talk to. And what separates Africa and Asia is the Nile. So the three bodies of water separating three continents in this shape after Noah's flood receded. And there is significance because not only does the material come from the doorstep of paradise into Europe, it also descends, because this shape is the Greek cross, the Tau cross, rather than 4 members, it's got 3 members. So we must imagine Christ being crucified here. That's his body, that's his right arm, that's his left arm, and his head or his heart, again, depending on which authority you're talking to, resides over Jerusalem. So that's the symbolism of this map, and therefore if you imagine something coming down from Asia into Europe, it comes from the land, from the heavens. Asia represents heaven, and Europe represents the land of the blessed, because they are on Christ's right. So before you even get the material to the workshop, this is a material that has descended from, as if from the heavens, into the land of the blessed. And this is standard geography that is known to everybody. Marco Polo, for example, talked about the Lapis mines in the 14th century. And therefore the material itself, the raw material, before any processing takes place, the raw material has spiritual value because it comes from the doorstep of paradise. I'm not going to read this because you've probably already read it. These are 3 couplets from a poem which is hundreds of couplets long by Marbode of Rennes, who is a 12th century bishop, northern France. And this, I'm putting these in just to give you clues as to the power of this stone. It draws responses from the realms above. In other words, if you pray in front of it, it will facilitate the answering of prayers. How it does that, given that this is written by an archbishop, is interesting, because it sounds idolatrous. It sounds like, you know, there's a stone that is going to intercede between you and God, but actually the stone is beneath you. So if you're thinking about what's on the other side of the stone, it's nothingness. So how can a stone intercede between you and God? I'm not going to go into that unless you want to ask questions later, but it tells you there's significant power. And this tells you there are significant responsibilities in addressing this rock because of those powers. This is back to Matthew Paris, the person who did that first map that I showed you. And this is a manuscript that is outlining the treasures of St. Albans Cathedral. And I hope you can recognize 2 things here that are lapis. Even in a PowerPoint against a white wall, you know, it's circled in gold, it's got blue, but it's got bits of white and gold in it. It's not a pure color. And on the other side, I've put a pax. A pax is a community building object that is circulated around the church where everybody is meant to kiss it. It's a bonding thing, and you kiss that. And that is a piece of unpurified lapis. And it is cut in a semicircle to remind you of the heavens and its origins in Asia. And it's not just got geographic origins that suggest heaven because of paradise being in the east. It's also got geological things that suggest it's heavenly. And Albertus Magnus, who was Thomas Aquinas' teacher, so absolutely central, mainstream Dominican thinker, who has since been made into the patron saint of scientists, wrote a book, a lapidary that is all about different stones. And he wrote a lot about lapis, and he described it as being the color of the midnight sky, streaked with white clouds and scattered with golden stars. So even the geological, scientific 13th century description of it relates back to the sky and to heaven. So, this is the material that is your raw material for making a pigment. But the trouble is, if you just ground this up, you'd have little particles. Some of them would be blue, some would be white, some would be gold. And it would be a kind of pale, muddy colour. You want to separate the different minerals that are in this rock. But if you do that, what you're doing is separating what God has put together. God built the doorstep of paradise with 3 minerals. And if you separate out the ones that you want from the ones that you don't want, you are committing an act of strife. In Empedoclean philosophy, there are 2 things that keep the world going. One of them is strife, which is making many out of one, dividing things, and love, which is making one out of many, uniting things. So if you're working within a religious or a philosophical environment, you don't want to do strife, because strife is divorce, separation. But actually, if you just want the pure blue, that's what you're doing. You are pulling asunder what God put together to make the doorstep of paradise. So this is quite significant and actually has, I would say, influenced the aesthetic up until today. This is my first example of lapis purified as ultramarine. Obviously it's not European, it's a Persian manuscript, but I chose it because it's a very nice example of having ripped apart what God put together, you then rejoin them. So having separated the blue and the white and the gold, you rejoin them. And if you think about the aesthetics of ancient Egyptian sculpture, you are again using blue and gold together. If you think about Matisse or Van Gogh on a good day, again it's this recombination of blue and gold because the blue and gold occurred together, and therefore if you separate them you want to bring them back together again. So to purify the lapis, which is this stuff, which is a combination of blue, white and gold material, you have to recognize that it's 3 different minerals. There's a gold one, which is called pyrites, there's a white one, which is, let's say, calcite, and then there's the blue stuff that you want. And therefore, to get those 3 as separate minerals, you have to engage in what we would call chemical engineering. And and in fact, the thing I will outline to you today is still used in an industrial context. It's a slightly different way of doing things, but it relies on exactly the same underlying theory. And where does that theory come from? Well, if we're looking at stuff which is 12th century and onwards, we're looking at Aristotle's 4 elements. And Aristotle's 4 elements, you might think in a Christian context, are anathema, because Aristotle's a pagan, but that's actually a divisive idea that's been amplified in the 19th century. If you go back, you realize that actually there's a lot of interaction. And Thomas Aquinas' main claim to fame as a Dominican is actually unifying the Aristotelian world with the Christian world. And this is an initial, at the beginning of the Bible, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. And I want you to look at these 4 roundels. The one at the top represents Aristotelian fire. This is the light of the moon, the sun and the moon coming to you. This is Aristotelian water. person with a spoon and an upturned vase with water coming out. This is Aristotelian earth, somebody with a plant and a spade, and this is Aristotelian air. This is the one that's least obvious. But he's holding a horn in one hand and a mirror in the other. And can you see these little things in between? They're species. The Aristotelian idea of how things travel is by constant cloning, if you like, of species. And so sound travels to your ear by the sound being constantly reproduced through the medium of air. And sight comes to your eye by the same cloning idea through the medium of air. So this is air, because air is the medium, is the element that mediates between us. If you can hear me and you can see me, it is by virtue of air that you can do that. So here are the four elements right at the very beginning of the Bible, and that's Christ in the middle. He's in the middle because the only person on earth who was ever perfectly balanced in the four elements was Christ. And that's basically saying this is identifying Christ's unique nature in Aristotelian terms. Now, what I'd like to do is go through, in less than 10 minutes, Aristotelian four-element theory, so that you can understand how the recipe works, because that is what is driving that chemical engineering. So we've got these four elements. We think of elements as building blocks. That's a modern idea. This predates it because this is a mode of being in the world. This is the solid mode of being in the world. This is the liquid, fluid mode of being in the world. That's the gaseous mode, and that's the consuming mode. And if we think about all things, they partake in a certain degree of solidity, a certain fluidity, a certain airiness, and they can be consumed. So the four elements are not building blocks, they are ways of being. That's the first thing. Second thing to know is that they are ways of being, each of which is defined by a pair of qualities. The qualities are two opposites, hot and cold, wet and dry. Right? So earth, solidity, is what happens when you have cold and dryness. That cold and dryness combined give you solidity. Cold and wetness combined give you fluidity, water. Wet and hot gives you gaseous, and hot and dry gives you consuming. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm going to have to motor through this. Now, because each of these modes of being is a combination of two qualities, you have two possible relationships. These are concordant relationships. Concordant relationships between ways of being are due to the fact that they share a quality. So earth and water are concordant, they're friends in Thomas Aquinas' term because they both are cold. Water and air are both wet, air and fire are both hot, fire and earth are both dry. So concordance or friendship is through a mediating quality that is shared by both. The other possible relationship is contrasting. Fire or consuming is hot and dry, whereas water is cold and wet. They have nothing in common, they are contrasting. Equally, earth and air are contrasting. And Thomas Aquinas called this empedocles cycle of love and strife. Everything that changes in the world changes through concordance or love and contrast or strife. So that's the first thing you need to know. You only need to know three things. So that's the first. The second is that if God had made the four elements perfectly, he would have made a sphere of earth nested within a sphere of water, nested within a sphere of air, nested within a sphere of fire. Now, he didn't do that because he just made heaven, and heaven was perfect. So to make earth perfect as well would be redundant. You've already got perfection. So earth is necessarily made imperfect. And the imperfection is what gives us stuff to do. There is teleology in all up to the, well, it's still in modern biology, although nobody dares say it. But things are purposeful. And for Aristotle, the purpose for all things was to achieve the perfection of which they are capable, which implies that they start off being imperfect. And in fact, if Earth was surrounded by water, we'd all drown. So, you know, it is providential that the world we live in of four elements is all mixed up. There's a bit of earth and a bit of air. Like this, if it is wood, has got earth, which is solidity, but it's also got fire in it because you could consume it if you wanted to. The chair is springy, it's got a bit of air in it, it's got a bit of water and fluidity, but it's got a bit of solidity. So everything is mixed. And we are mixed as well. And the mixture within us depends upon our mood, our physiological state, whether we've drunk too much alcohol, whether we respond to alcohol, which is spirit, fire, water. We can get phlegmatic, which is washed out and sorry for yourself. Or you can get choleric, which is aggressive and fiery. So imbalance, there are imbalances, which is all part of mixing the four elements. So everything in theory is mixed. No, everything in practice is mixed. But everything knows in theory, in an ideal world, it would be in this arrangement. So if water is in this position, it's happy, right? If we have a drop of water in the sphere of air, it knows it is above its ideal station in life. So it falls, and that's why rain falls. But if the drop of water is in the earth, it's below its ideal station, and so it rises. And that's why you have springs that rise and water that falls. If you have fire that's trapped in the earth, you have a volcano, because it's seriously interested in getting up there. So these things will move, and they will move according to trying to achieve the perfection of which they are capable. Fire will always rise. That's why it's one of a very important spiritual symbol. Earth will always fall, but air and water will rise or fall according to where they are. In other words, they have properties of levity and gravity that is personal motivation for them. They are not the victims of some impersonal force. That's quite an important point. And this is summed up with degrees of density or subtlety. They will naturally move towards the more subtle or naturally move towards the more dense, depending on where they are. But not everything, so that's the second thing you need to know, that they have an ideal place they want to be in the world, and they will achieve that movement of their own volition. That's their purpose in life. The third thing you need to know is that they can't all move equally well. And Plato identified that tetrahedron, octahedron, icosahedron and cube as the four geometric forms of the four elements. I'm not going to talk about the fifth element, ether, because that's only in heaven. That's a dodecahedron. But these shapes, which should not be taken literally, give you two more sets of properties. It can be either sharp or blunt, or it can be mobile or immobile. Right? The sharp mobility of fire is what makes it a consuming element. It can penetrate into and redistribute. So if you put a piece of wood in the fire, in half, it will be penetrated by the sharpness and redistributed by the mobility of the fire. So this is not about it being consumed really, it's about being redistributed through the world. So we've got a pair of properties here. If we go back to the first thing I talked about, we've got these other pairs. These are the properties associated with the qualities, this is their position in the universe, and this is their shape. Okay? As postmodern people, we think we're clever, having come up with the idea of intersectionality. Well, this is Empedoclean intersectionality, that nothing is defined by one context, one property. We are all, including so-called inanimate things, a kind of Venn diagram of different concepts. That's showing you three of those: sharp, blunt, mobile, immobile, subtle and dense. But I flatter myself that the previous PowerPoint slide's a bit easier to read. So that's the kind of thinking that would underlie how you might change a mineral, a collection of three minerals, into three separate minerals. I'm now going to run through Cennini's recipe, the thing that I put the reference for right at the beginning. This is a process I've done. It works very well. I've seen YouTube things saying they're doing it. They are not. I can tell you why later if you want. But the first thing you do, according to Cennini, and I should say that Cennini's is not the first recipe. It's probably about 150 years, building on 150 years of recipes. And this same recipe was still being used in the 19th century by Winsor and Newton when they made genuine ultramarine as opposed to French ultramarine. So what he says is you grind your lapis, which is this rock with three different minerals in it, in a bronze mortar. And then you work it up as a dry powder on a porphyry slab. Now, you don't need to use a bronze mortar, you don't need to use a porphyry slab. I didn't, I had other material. But these are the first clues, bronze and porphyry, that Cennini is giving you, that he knows the philosophical context of this recipe. And I won't say right now, but I might forget later. These, strictly speaking, are not necessary, but they are symbolically appropriate. Then, for every pound of powdered up rock, you take 6 ounces of pine resin, 3 ounces of gum mastic, and 3 ounces of fresh wax. You then melt that mixture into a ball, and you knead it with your hands, having covered your hands with oil. And it's hard work because you're kneading essentially a ball of rock in rather sticky hot beeswax. And you have to do that occasionally for at least 3 days and nights. Now, this is quite a long process. And you do have to do it for a long time. It is literally like kneading bread, although quite a lot harder. So that's the first part, and you keep going for 3 days and nights. 3 days and nights, again, you might do more, you might do less. But that's, again, a symbolic time frame. There are 3 minerals. This comes from the doorstep of paradise. We are within a Trinitarian worldview. 3 days and nights is probably a reflection of that Trinitarian nature. So the second part, after you've done 3 days and nights of kneading this ball, you then transfer it to a pot of warm lye. Lye is water in which is dissolved the ash of a burnt tree. We would call it alkali. The prefix al is Arabic, obviously, and this is showing that this science isn't of European origin. It came from the sphere of Islam into Europe, along with the material itself. So the import of material is accompanied by an intellectual import of Aristotelian ideas. And the alkali, according to Albertus Magnus, mysteriously transfers the fire from the wood into the water. So when you set fire to the tree, the sharp mobile element penetrates and redistributes it, but you're left with a residue. That residue is the residue of fire. When you put that in water, you end up with alkali. Alkali is caustic. If you put your hands in it, it would burn your flesh off. So you continue to need it, but you don't do it with your hands, because if you do, you're in trouble. So you need it with sticks. Now I found this particularly difficult because it's a bit like kneading a ball, a ball of rock with chopsticks. I'm not sure how you do it. So I probably didn't do it very well. But you do that, you continue to do that, again, for a very long time. As you're doing it, the lye will slowly turn blue. So when you feel you've got enough, you decant the lye and you get another bucket of lye and you put the ball in that bucket of lye and you carry on. Cennini says you repeat 18 times. Now again, 18 is not strictly necessary. You would do more if it was a rock with a lot of blue stuff in it. You would do less if it didn't have much blue stuff in it. So he's again saying 18 because he's saying, I know the theory that lies behind this. I'm not telling you, but I know it. And that's because I didn't go into it. But when Plato came up with those 4 different shapes for the elements, he also did something numerological with the way in which they related to each other, and 18 is the number of water, or in one of the ways of interpreting the very cryptic clues that Plato left, 18 could be water. So this is Cennini saying, this is a recipe about Aristotelian water. So each time, 18 times, you let the blue stuff settle, you decant the lye, and or rather you have 18 pots, each of which has got blue stuff that's settled to the bottom. You decant the lye, you dry the powder. He then tells you to combine those extracts into 3 or more grades, and he tells you how much you can sell the top grade for. Now what this is suggesting is that each time you extract into a different bottle of lye, you're getting a different grade of pigment, which turns out to be very expensive coming out, first royal blue and then kind of pale blue and cheap towards the end. So how do we post-rationalize? And as a scientist, I think this is very important. We always think science is predictive. 99.999% of the time, science is not predictive. It is able to post-rationalize. So I'm going to post-rationalize that recipe that does work in terms of the 4 elements. These are the 3 ingredients that are in the rock. These are the 4 elements. Air, we're saying, hasn't got much to do with this, but it is mainly a relationship between fire and water. And I've put this rock next to fire and that blue stuff we want next to water, because this rock today, geologically, when it's found on its own, is called pyrites. Pyrites is a compound of 2 words, pyros and ites. Ites means like, and pyros means fire. So this stone was called by the Greeks fire-like, and we still call it fire-like. Ultramarine is watery. People aren't bothered by ultramarine. It hasn't got such a history. But the reason why something gets assigned to a predominant element, all of these are mixed elements, the 4 elements mixed together, but there's a dominance of fire in this. The dominance of fire shows in a number of ways, and those ways are collectively known as the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures is God made things for our use on earth, and he told us how to use them. And the use of something is its signature. Most drugs come from the idea of, even today, aspirin is still the most readily taken drug. That is an anti-inflammatory that was originally extracted from the bark of a willow tree. The willow says it's happy in water. Inflammation can get worse, something like rheumatism and arthritis when it's by water. So you take something, an extract of something which is happy with water, and that's what aspirin is. And all of ethnopharmacology is based on various different cultural versions of the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures of the willow tree is, I'm happy by water. The doctrine of signatures that tells you this is fiery, because the Greek called it fire-like, is, first of all, its colour. Gold is the colour of the sun, which is the archetypal fire. Second thing is, if you hit this, it creates a spark. Not all rocks spark when hit, but this one does. So there's fire residing within it that wants to come out when you hit it. If you set fire to that rock, and you can't set fire to all rocks, but you can set fire to that one, you get a hideous stench of sulfur, which is brimstone, the fires of hell. So smell, sight, behaviors are all saying this is fiery. Okay, we could go through, but I've got an eye on the clock, and I'm not going to go through the others. But if we imagine that the three minerals are predominantly fire, earth, and water, what Cennini is doing is putting them in an environment that allows them to move. The first thing is you have to have individual grains of each thing. Now he's putting them in resin, wax, stuff like that. And these are things that are exuded from trees, most of them. Gum arabic is a tree exudate. So they share symbolically the same kind of nature as amber. And there's all, you can just look up myths about amber, loads of myths about amber. Pliny said that when the sun set in the Western Ocean, its rays of light coagulated. Amber is coagulated sunlight that floats across the ocean towards you. And he said, but obviously that's rubbish, because actually we know that it comes from the Baltic, and it comes from the Baltic after a sustained wind from the north for 3 days. And that's true. If you go to the east coast of England, you will find amber 3 days after a northerly storm. And it's got insect trapped in it. So he knows that it's not the tears of, it's not the coagulated rays of light. He knows it comes from a tree, but he also repeats another myth, which is that when Phaeton crashed his father's chariot and died, his sisters mourned and the gods got sick of them weeping and turned them into trees, but they continued to weep. And this amber is the daughters of the sun weeping. So mythologies and the doctrine of signatures tell you that these are fiery things. And so Cennini's ball of rock is elemental fire. So you're taking three minerals, one of which is fire, one of which is earth, one of which is water, and you're putting them in a ball of elemental fire. Pyrites is hot and dry, it's fiery, it's in its element, as we still say, which is interesting that we have Aristotelian ideas that are still in circulation, but they're not recognized as Aristotelian. Calcite is cold and dry, so it shares dryness with the fireball, so it's concordant. It's not at home, but it doesn't really mind. The blue stuff we want is cold and wet, so it is contrasting. It really wants to get out. So the gold stuff is retained in the ball. The white stuff is released slowly. It comes out slowly because if it's got a choice when you're kneading it in the lye. It can be in a ball of fire or it can be in a bucket of water. Either way, it's not at home. Either way, it will be concordant. So it's not motivated to get out, but gravity makes it fall and immobility makes it fall slowly. Whereas the blue stuff comes out quickly. It's in contrast. It is motivated to move. It's got gravity helps it move and mobility helps it move. That's why the best stuff comes out first. That's why you change the price of the grade as you go along. So that's me post-rationalizing Aristotle. as far as I'm concerned, makes perfect sense. It is not modern science, which is mathematically based and experimental. Experimental means actually detaching yourself from the world and retreating into a laboratory. That's what science is. Science is a retreat. Modern science is a retreat from the world. This is phenomenological science, which is engaging with the world. But I've had the privilege to work on things like the Westminster Retable. This is a chip of blue paint on a white ground. This is the a spectrum which shows that it's aluminium silicates, which is the way we would think about it. So I know, and this is 1260, so this is it being used as a material at almost exactly the same time that Albertus Magnus was writing about it. So I know that this is in circulation. I know that that theory is accompanied by practice in art. I also know from analysing with different scientific methods the use of materials. This is the Met Pontifical, so this is about the same date as Marco Polo. Can you see the blue and gold background? I said the blue and gold were together, and so you rejoin them. And that blue in the background looks the same to the eye as that blue in the robes. But actually, this tells us there are two different blues. This one is ultramarine, high status. This one is German blue, low status. You can't tell by eye, but they knew, and they differentiated between these. And, sorry? Azurite. This, which you probably know in the National Gallery, is a incredible Aristotelian, well, I mean, it's a lot of things, but one of the things is that this is a relationship between heaven and earth, and it is expressed in the terms of Aristotle's four elements. I won't go into that because I've run out of time, but I have written about it if you're interested. So thank you very much.